On a grey morning, mist gathers low over a mound of earth in western Turkey, not far from the mouth of a river that has changed its course so many times across the centuries that no map from antiquity would recognize its current path. The hill is called Hisarlik. It rises modestly above the surrounding plain, unremarkable to anyone who might pass it without knowing what lies beneath. There are no towers here now, no gates, no fires burning behind stone walls. There is only the quiet accumulation of soil upon soil, layer upon layer, each one holding the compressed memory of a city that rose and rose again, and burned again across some 3,000 years of habitation. Beneath this dust, archaeologists believe, sleep the walls of Troy. The mist does not linger long once the sun begins its slow climb. But for those quiet hours before dawn fully arrives, the plain holds a stillness that feels older than it has any right to feel. Sheep move somewhere in the middle distance, their bells sounding faint and irregular, and the wind carries the scent of dry grass and turned earth. It is difficult, standing here, to imagine the sounds that once filled this same air. The clash of bronze against bronze, the groan of wooden ships being dragged onto a shore not far from where the mound now sits. The voices of men calling to their gods in a language that has been dead for longer than most civilizations have existed. And yet the plain remains, patient in the way that only landscapes can be patient, holding its silence over what it has witnessed. To understand why this hill matters, one must first understand the world that surrounded it in the centuries before its final destruction. The Eastern Mediterranean in the late Bronze Age was a world of interconnected kingdoms, each linked to the others through trade routes that stretched from the coast of what is now Turkey to the islands of the Aegean, down through Crete and mainland Greece, across to Egypt and the Levant. Ships carried tin and copper for bronze making, olive oil, wine, ceramics, ideas, and marriages between royal houses. Palaces rose at Mycenae, at Pylos, at Knossos, each one a center of administration and ritual, each one governed by kings who kept careful records of grain and oil and the movements of their subjects on clay tablets that would, centuries later, be found still bearing the impressions of styluses pressed by hands long turned to dust. This was a world held together by fragile threads of commerce and alliance, and like all such worlds, it was vulnerable to disruption. Historians who study this period speak of a collapse that swept across the region near the end of the second millennium, before the Common Era. A collapse whose causes remain debated even now. Drought is often mentioned. Earthquakes, the movement of unknown peoples across the sea. Peoples the Egyptians called raiders from the islands, arriving suddenly on coasts that had known generations of peace. Whatever the precise causes, palace after palace fell silent within a span of decades. Mycenae's Megaron burned. Pylos was abandoned. The great networks of trade that had sustained kings and craftsmen alike unraveled, and with them, much of the literacy and record-keeping that had defined the age. It is into this larger unraveling that the story of Troy is often placed. Whether as cause or symptom, no one can say with certainty. What can be said is that Hisarlik itself shows clear evidence of destruction consistent with warfare, during roughly the period in which a Trojan War might have occurred, somewhere in the 12th or 13th century before the Common Era. There are burn layers, there are skeletal remains showing signs of violent death. There are sling stones, the kind used in siege warfare, scattered in quantities that suggest sustained conflict rather than a single skirmish. Whether this particular destruction corresponds precisely to the war that later generations would sing about, no archaeologist can say with full confidence. The soil does not label itself. It simply holds what happened, layered and mute, waiting for those willing to dig carefully enough to ask it questions. And yet the war, if it happened as remembered, would not have been remembered at all had it not been carried forward by voices. This is where the story shifts from stone and soil to breath and memory, from the archaeological to the oral, and it is here that we must speak of Homer. It is tempting, and has always been tempting, to imagine Homer as a single man, blind perhaps, sitting with a lyre in some sunlit courtyard on the island of Chios or along the coast of Ionia, composing from nothing the great epics that bear his name. But this image, comforting as it is, does not match what scholars now understand about how these poems came into being. The Iliad and the Odyssey, as they exist in the form we now read them, are almost certainly the product of centuries of oral tradition, refined and reshaped by countless singers before ever being fixed into the written form that has survived to us. Homer, if such a man existed at all in the way later Greeks imagined him, was perhaps less an author in the modern sense and more a final voice in a long chain of voices. A rhapsode who inherited formulas, phrases, and entire episodes that had already been sung for generations before he ever opened his mouth to recite them. The language of the poems themselves supports this. Scholars have long noted that Homeric Greek is not the language of any single time or place, but an artificial blend, layering together vocabulary and grammatical forms from different centuries and different regions of the Greek-speaking world. Some phrases preserve linguistic features so old that they seem to reach back toward the Bronze Age itself, the very period in which the war they describe would have occurred. Other elements are clearly later additions, reflecting the world of the poet's own time, centuries after any historical Troy had fallen. The poems, in other words, are palimpsests, texts written over other texts, memories layered over other memories, much like the very mound at Hisarlik itself, city built atop city, each one leaving its trace within the one that follows. This layering is worth pausing on, because it shapes everything that follows in this account. When we speak of Odysseus, we are not speaking of a man whose journey was recorded by a contemporary witness, nor even by a poet who lived close enough to any real conflict to have spoken with survivors. We are speaking of a figure remembered across centuries of retelling, his voyage reshaped by each generation of singers who added their own understanding of geography, their own fears of the sea, their own half-memories of half-forgotten lands, by the time the story reached the form in which it was finally written down, likely sometime in the 8th century before the Common Era. Whatever kernel of historical truth it once contained had already been transformed many times over into something closer to myth than to history. And yet myths are rarely built from nothing. Beneath the fantastical elements, the man-eating giants and the enchantresses who turn sailors into swine, there often lies a substrate of real geography, real sailing routes, real dangers that Bronze Age and early Iron Age sailors would have known intimately. The sea itself, in this sense, becomes a kind of witness, more patient than any human memory, holding within its currents and its coastlines the physical truths that inspired even the most fantastical episodes of the tale. This documentary exists to trace that patient witness, not to insist that Odysseus was a real man who sailed a real ship past a real cave holding a real one-eyed giant. For such certainty the evidence does not allow, but rather to ask, gently and without urgency, which shores along this ancient voyage correspond to places a listener today might visit, might stand upon, might feel the same wind that once filled the sails of ships, now 3,000 years gone. To ask where the story of a homecoming, however embellished across centuries of retelling, might still touch the actual stone and actual water of the Mediterranean world. We begin as the story itself begins, on this grey morning over the plain of Troy, where mist still rises from ground that once held a burning city, and where a war that changed the memory of an entire civilization first gave birth to the man who would spend 10 long years finding his way home. If you find comfort in these slow unravelings of ancient journeys, in the quiet tracing of legend back towards stone and sea, you are welcome to stay a while longer, and perhaps to return again for more lost voyages when sleep next proves difficult to find. The story that follows moves slowly, as the sea itself moves, patient and unhurried, carrying us now from the smouldering plain of Troy toward the restless waters that would keep one man from home for 10 long years, testing not his strength alone, but the very patience of memory that would one day carry his name across 3,000 years of retelling. From palace floors long turned to dust, through the careful hands of scribes in ages he could never have imagined, into whatever quiet room now holds you as you listen, wherever in the world that room might be, however far from the wine-dark waters where this story first began its long and patient drift toward us. He was, by the time the horse had done its work and the towers of Troy had folded into ash, a man already tired in a way that no amount of sleep could touch. The poets would call him many things across the centuries: cunning, enduring, godlike in his patience, hateful in his deceptions, depending on who was doing the telling and what they needed from him that day. But before any of those names settled onto him like sediment on a harbour floor, he was simply a king of a small and rocky place, a husband who had left a young wife standing on a shore, a father who had kissed a son too small to remember the shape of his face. Whatever he would become in the retelling, he began as someone who had simply wanted, more than anything, to go home. His island was called Ithaca, and it still sits, if the old identification holds, among the scatter of land in the Ionian Sea, west of the Greek mainland, in a cluster of islands that seem, even now, to hold themselves apart from the grander, sun-drenched fame of their Aegean cousins. Where Crete stretched wide and Aegean itself, with its blue coves, its whitewashed towns wearing an antiquity, Ithaca kept to itself, grey-green and folded, more stone than beach, more goat path than road. It was never a place of empires. It could not have fed an army or armed a fleet on its own resources. And this, more than any adornment the poem later gave it, may be the truest thing Homer preserved about it: that Odysseus ruled not a rich land, but a modest one, a kingdom of thin soil and rocky slopes, of scattered farmsteads, and a harbour small enough that a man could know, by sound alone, whether the boats returning were his. To stand on the real Ithaca today, for there is a real Ithaca, an island bearing that name still, anchored in the same waters the ancient geographers described, is to feel the strange vertigo of walking through a story that has outlived every generation that told it. The island rises in twin masses of limestone, joined by a narrow isthmus, so that from certain angles it seems almost to be two islands leaning together, sharing a single low waste of land between two harbours. Its hills are covered in scrub oak and wild olive, in patches of cypress that darken with the falling light, and in the terraced remains of centuries of farming, stone walls built and rebuilt by hands that could not have known they were echoing something. The northern town looks out over a deep, well-sheltered bay. The southern coast opens toward the strait that separates Ithaca from its larger neighbour, Kephallonia, close enough that on a still evening you could imagine a swimmer crossing between them, though no one, in memory, seems to have tried. For over a century, scholars and archaeologists have argued, sometimes with real bitterness, sometimes with the gentler frustration of people chasing a shadow they suspect will never quite resolve into a shape, over whether this island, the one that has carried the name Ithaca since before Roman times, is truly the island Homer described, or whether the poem's Ithaca was some composite, some half-remembered blending of coastlines, gathered from sailors' tales and reassembled by a poet who may never have sailed those waters himself. The debate is not trivial, though it may sound so to ears unused to the particular stubbornness of classical scholars. Homer's description of Ithaca includes details that some readers have found difficult to square with the island's actual geography. A suggestion, in one famous passage, that Ithaca lies low and farthest out to sea among its neighboring islands, when in truth it is Kephallonia that spreads low and wide, with Ithaca rising steep and compact just to its east. Some have proposed that Kephallonia's own smaller peninsula, or even a corner of the island now called Lefkada, might once have borne the name Ithaca, before political boundaries and local pride reshuffled which rock answered to which ancient word. It is worth pausing here, in this calm room where you are listening, to say plainly that this uncertainty is not a flaw in the story, not a crack that undoes it. If anything, it is the very texture of what makes these old poems so strange and so alive across the centuries, that they were never meant as surveys, never intended as the kind of precise cartography a modern reader instinctively wants from them. Homer's Ithaca, whatever coastline first inspired it, was already, by the time it reached the page, if it ever passed through anything so fixed as a single page in Homer's own lifetime, a blend of memory and invention, of real harbors remembered by generations of sailors and reshaped by the needs of a story that had to end somewhere, that had to give its wandering king a shore to return to. Archaeology has found, on the real Ithaca, traces that seem to reach back far enough to touch the edges of that world. The remains of a Bronze Age settlement at a place now called the School of Homer, ancient terracing, fragments of pottery, a cave on the northern coast, the Cave of the Nymphs, as later tradition would call it, or Marmarospilia in the modern Greek, furnished with stalactites and a strange, chambered darkness that later visitors, standing in torchlight, could not help but imagine as the very cave where the poem's hero once hid his treasure. Whether any of these places are truly the places Homer meant, or whether they simply grew into that meaning over centuries of visitors wanting them to be true, is a question that this account will not try to force into a false certainty. It is enough for now simply to walk the coastline in imagination, to feel the narrow harbors, the goat-cropped hills, and to hold the possibility gently. The possibility that somewhere beneath the layers of later building and later myth, a real king once looked out from a real hill at a real modest sea and wanted, more than any treasure Troy could offer, simply to be standing there again. Before that longing could take shape into the 10 years of wandering the poem is named for, there had already been 10 other years, a decade at Troy, a decade spent in the mud and the waiting and the long, grinding patience of siege warfare, where the war that legend compresses into a handful of dramatic episodes was, in truth, mostly this: standing watch, mending gear, burying friends, watching ships rot slowly on a foreign beach while a city refused, year after year, to fall. Odysseus had not wanted to go to that war at all, if certain older strands of the story are to be believed. Had feigned madness, some versions say, sowing salt into furrowed fields in the hope of being judged unfit to leave home, until a rival's trick exposed the pretense and dragged him, however unwillingly, into the ships bound for Asia Minor. Whatever the truth of that particular tale, what the poem gives us as settled fact is this: that by the time Troy burned, Odysseus had already spent 10 years away from the wife and son and father and rocky hillside he called his own, and had earned, if any man ever earns such a thing, the right to a straight and uneventful voyage home. The sea, as it so often does in these old stories, had other plans, and so the 10 years of war would be followed, almost without pause, without even the mercy of a season's rest, by 10 more years of wandering, a doubling of exile that the poem seems to offer almost as a kind of cosmic arithmetic, as though the gods needed the number 20 to balance some ledger only they could read. 20 years in total, between the young man who sailed for Troy and the older, wearier man who would eventually, if eventually is even the right word for a journey so patient in its cruelty, climb the last hill toward his own home. 20 years in which a son grew from infancy into manhood without ever once seeing his father's face. 20 years in which a wife wove and unwove the same shroud on her loom, buying time against suitors who circled her house like gulls around a beached whale, refusing to believe, or refusing to admit believing, that the man she waited for might already be gone. It is this long doubling, the war behind him, the wandering ahead, that the coming account will trace, not as spectacle, not chasing the drama of monsters and storms for their own sake, but as a slow tracking of coastlines and currents, the shadowed remains of old harbours, the places where ancient sailors might genuinely have stopped, taken on water, mistaken an island for a demon or a demon for an island, and lived to tell it strangely enough that the strangeness outlived them by 3,000 years. This will not be a search for proof, in the way a courtroom seeks proof, nor a dismissal of the poem as pure invention, in the way certain brisk modern skepticism prefers. It will be something quieter than either. An inquiry conducted at the pace of a slow boat along a coast at dusk, watching the light change on limestone cliffs, wondering, without needing an answer by morning, whether the particular curve of that bay, the particular color of that current where two seas meet, might be the very thing a tired soldier once saw and never quite forgot. Even after 20 years, even after the horse, even after the God-sent storms that would soon begin to gather, far out past the smouldering ruin of Troy, over waters that did not yet know they were about to become famous. The ships left Troy with the smoke still visible behind them, a low grey smear against a sky that had not yet decided whether to clear. 12 vessels, low and dark-hulled, moved out from the shallows where the fighting had ended, carrying men who had spent 10 years learning the geography of a single stretch of coastline, and now had to remember, all at once, how to read a wider sea. There is a particular kind of disorientation that comes after a long siege. The body accustomed to walls and trenches, to the sightlines of a single battlefield, suddenly asked to trust the horizon again. The rowers found their rhythm slowly. The sails, when they were raised, caught the wind unevenly, as though the cloth itself needed to relearn its purpose. And somewhere in that first day of true departure, with Troy shrinking behind them into a shape no larger than a thumbprint, the fleet turned north and east toward a coastline the poem calls the land of the Cicones, and a city it names Ismarus. This detour, small as it seems against the scale of the whole voyage, matters enormously to anyone tracing the Odyssey against the map of the real world, because it is the first moment where myth and geography visibly touch. The Cicones were not an invention. Ancient geographers, Herodotus among the later ones, and Thracian records reaching further back than Homer himself, describe a Thracian people occupying roughly this stretch of coastline, north of the Aegean's central waters, in the region that classical writers called Thrace and modern maps, divide between Greece, Bulgaria, and the European edge of Turkey. Thrace was, to the Greeks of the Bronze and early Iron Age, a real and known frontier, not the edge of the world, not the unmapped dark that would later swallow Odysseus's ships whole, but a hard, familiar, dangerous border where Greek-speaking sailors traded, raided, and occasionally died. To place the first stop of the homeward voyage here is to place it, quite precisely, in the last patch of chartable water. Before the story begins its slow drift into uncertainty. It is the last moment in the entire Odyssey where a listener, ancient or modern, could point to a location on a map with real confidence and say, yes, this exists, this is here, ships did sail this water, and men did trade and fight along this coast. The poem does not linger long on the arrival. Odysseus tells it later at the court of the Phaeacians, in the compressed and almost embarrassed tone of a man recounting a decision he no longer fully stands behind. The fleet came ashore. The men sacked the city. They took the women, the wine, the livestock, the portable wealth of a coastal town that had done nothing, in the story as told, to deserve the visit. A town that simply existed on the route home, and existed within reach, and so was treated the way returning armies of that era often treated whatever lay within reach. It is worth sitting with this for a moment, because it complicates the shape of the hero at the center of the tale. Odysseus is not, in this early scene, a man beset by monsters and unlucky winds. He is a man making a choice. The raid on Ismarus is not something that happens to him. It is something he does deliberately with his men, as a kind of final soldier's habit carried over from 10 years of siege warfare, where seizing what could be seized was simply how armies behaved on their way from one place to another. The historical Cicones, if the identification is right, paid the price for that habit. What makes the episode function so well as a hinge between history and myth is what follows the raid, because the Cicones do not simply vanish into the role of passive victims. They send word inland to kinsmen living further from the coast, described in the poem as more numerous, better armed, more accustomed to fighting from chariots and on foot in open formation than the exhausted men who have just finished dismantling their shoreline town. This detail carries a texture of real Thracian military reputation. Ancient sources elsewhere describe Thracian warriors as formidable, organized, unwilling to be treated as an easy coastal target. The counterattack comes at dawn, catching Odysseus's men still gathered on the beach, still dividing plunder, still slow with wine and the particular fatigue of victory. The fighting that follows is not glorious. It is the poem's first real cost of the voyage. Not shipwreck, not monster, but a straightforward, human, entirely plausible battlefield loss. 6 men from each ship, the poem says, do not make it back to the boats. Multiply that loss across 12 vessels, and the arithmetic becomes sobering. This is not a story of a fleet that sails from Troy full and arrives home empty because of storms and sorcery and the wrath of Poseidon alone. Some of that emptying happens here, on the very first stop, because of a raid that the fleet itself chose to conduct, against a people who fought back with a strength no one expected. It is possible to walk this stretch of Thracian coastline today, or to sail it, in low afternoon light, and try to imagine which particular curve of shoreline might correspond to the poem's Ismarus. No certain identification survives. The ancient sources that name the Cicones do not draw a map precise enough for modern archaeology to plant a flag with confidence. Some scholars have pointed toward the region near what was later the Greek colony of Maronea, on the coast of what is now northeastern Greece, close to the mouth of a river the ancients associated with Thracian wine, a detail that resonates strangely with the poem's own emphasis on the wine taken from Ismarus. Wine strong enough, later chapters will show, to prove useful against far stranger dangers than Thracian spearmen. Whether or not Maronea is the precise site, the broader region fits the poem's geography well enough to satisfy anyone tracing this voyage, not for forensic certainty, but for atmosphere, for the particular texture of a landscape that could plausibly have hosted both a coastal raid and the counterattack that followed it. Low hills behind a narrow beach, a river mouth offering fresh water, and, perhaps, the vineyards the story remembers so specifically. A horizon that, from the shore, gives no warning of the numbers gathering inland. The fleet that pulls away from Ismarus is smaller than the one that left Troy, and it carries something else now too. Not just a diminished crew, but the first mark of a pattern that will define the entire voyage. A stop made for practical reasons, supplies, plunder, the soldier's habit of taking what can be taken, becomes a delay, and the delay becomes a wound, and the wound changes the shape of everything that follows. It is at this point, with the ships pushing back out from the Thracian coast, weighted with grief and stolen wine in roughly equal measure, that the poem introduces the storm. This is worth pausing on, because the storm at this stage of the voyage is not yet the storm of legend, not the wrath of a god insulted, not the punishment that will come later for greater offenses. It is, in the plainest reading, simply weather. The Aegean in late summer and early autumn is known, to this day, for sudden and violent gales, particularly in the region where the open sea narrows and funnels between the Greek mainland and the scattering of islands to the east. Sailors of the ancient world feared this season specifically. Merchant fleets planned their calendars around it, choosing to end long voyages before its onset, rather than risk being caught on open water when it arrived. Ancient and modern sailors alike describe these gales as arriving with little warning. A shift in the color of the sky, a change in the smell of the air, and then wind strong enough to tear sails and snap the discipline of even a well-drilled fleet. That the poem places such a storm immediately after Ismarus, before any mention of divine anger, lends the moment a strange, understated credibility. It reads less like myth, reaching for its first supernatural flourish, and more like an old sailor's memory of the ordinary hazard that every homeward voyage in that season had to survive or did not. The poem describes 9 days of being driven by this wind, the ships no longer choosing their course, but simply enduring it. The men lowering what sail they can and gripping whatever holds steady, watching the coast, any coast, the coast they had only just left, disappear behind curtains of rain and spray. There is no monster in this passage, there is no enchantment. There is only wind and water, and a fleet that had already, before any of the famous dangers arrived, begun to lose its bearings. When the storm finally passes and the ships find calmer water, the poem admits, almost offhandedly, that no one aboard could say exactly where they were. The last reliable coastline, the Thracian shore, the land of the Cicones, the final piece of charted world in the entire epic, has slipped away behind them. And what lies ahead is water that the sailors of Odysseus's era did not have names for, current patterns they had never learned, headlands that matched nothing in memory. It is this image, more than the raid itself, that seems to anchor the shift the poem is making. From a story that begins, however uneasily, inside history, to one that begins drifting into something else. 12 ships, fewer men aboard than when they left Troy, sails torn or lowered, moving through grey water under a sky that offers no landmarks and no certainty. Carrying wine from a town they should perhaps have left alone, and grief for men who will not be sailing home. Whatever Ismarus was, whichever quiet stretch of Thracian coastline it corresponds to, if it corresponds to any single place at all, it stands now as the last solid thing behind them. Ahead is the story the world would remember. Behind is the last stretch of coastline anyone could have named with confidence, fading now into the same grey distance that had already swallowed the smoke of Troy. The wind that carried them onward after Ismarus was not kind, though it was not cruel either. It simply blew the way winds do, indifferent to the men who trimmed their sails against it. And after 9 days of drift, 9 days that the poem compresses into a single breath, though anyone who has spent 9 days on open water knows how long such a breath can feel. The ships came at last to a shore that seemed to promise nothing more than any other shore. No temple marked it. No smoke rose from a distant town to warn them off or draw them in. There was only sand, pale and endless, and a line of low green growing where the dunes gave way to some gentler soil, and the sound of the surf falling against a coast that must have looked, from a distance, very much like every other coast they had already passed, and would still have to pass before home became more than a word. Historians and geographers, across centuries of trying to pin the wandering poem to an actual map, have most often let their fingers rest somewhere along the coast of North Africa when this part of the story comes due, somewhere near the island now called Djerba, off the Tunisian shore, or along the wider curve of what the ancients knew as Libya, a word that then meant something closer to all the coastline west of Egypt than any single country a modern listener would recognize. The reasoning is not forced. Djerba, even today, carries a soft local tradition of being the lotus eater's island, a claim repeated in guidebooks and told to travelers with the particular fondness places develop for legends that flatter them. The land there is low and sandy, fringed with a scrub of hardy trees that produce a small, sweet fruit, and the light along that coast has the same flattened, dreamlike quality that a listener might imagine settling over men who had already lost 9 days to open water and had begun, perhaps, to stop trusting their own sense of how much time was passing at all. What the lotus itself might have been is a question the ancient world seems to have found less urgent than we might expect, given how much has been built upon it since. Homer offers almost nothing to work with: a flower, a fruit, an effect, and no botany. Later writers, filling the gap the way later writers always do, reached for candidates that existed in their own world and could plausibly have grown along that stretch of coast. The most persistent guess, repeated by Herodotus and taken up by others after him, points to a small tree bearing a date-like fruit, likely a variety of jujube, Ziziphus lotus, a modest, thorny shrub that still grows wild across parts of North Africa and the wider Mediterranean rim, producing berries that are sweet, mildly narcotic in large quantities, and entirely unremarkable to look at. It is a strange thing to stand before a plant that history has accused of erasing men's will to go home, and find only a low, scrubby bush with small orange fruit, the kind of plant a traveler might walk past without a second glance. But perhaps that is exactly the point the old story was reaching toward, whether or not its tellers could have said so directly. That the thing which undoes a person does not need to announce itself with size or menace. It only needs to be sweet and close at hand, and easy to reach for when the alternative is another stretch of grey water with no promise of an end. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that the lotus eaters themselves are barely described as a people at all. They offer no threat. They raise no weapon, set no trap, speak no lie. Homer gives them almost no character beyond their gentleness. They receive the scouting party kindly, share their food freely, and if there is anything sinister in them, it exists only in the fact that they never think to warn their guests what the fruit will do. Perhaps they no longer remember themselves. Perhaps forgetting has settled so completely over their island that even the memory of what forgetting costs has been lost along with everything else. It is a rare thing in this poem, and rarer still in the wider body of Greek myth, for an encounter to hold no monster at its center, no serpent, no sorceress, no creature with too many heads or too sharp a hunger. Here there is only a plant and a shore, and the terrible softness of a place that asks nothing of you except that you stay. The men who eat the lotus do not become violent or transformed or trapped by any external force. They simply stop wanting to leave. The poem describes it plainly. Those who tasted the fruit lost all desire to report back or return, wishing instead to remain among the lotus eaters, feeding on the flower, forgetful of their homeward journey. There is no chain around them, no wall, no guard. If they stay, it is only because staying has become, for them, indistinguishable from peace. And this, more than any Cyclops or storm the poem will offer later, deserves to be recognized as one of the truest dangers threading through the entire voyage. Not violence, not monstrosity, but the pull toward simply stopping, toward letting the memory of Ithaca soften at the edges until it no longer aches, toward choosing, quietly and without any dramatic gesture, to let the journey end here, on this warm shore, among people who ask for nothing and offer in return the one thing that 10 years of war and now more months of open water have made almost unbearably desirable: the absence of longing itself. It is worth pausing on how easily this could have been the end of everything. Not a shipwreck, not a monster's jaw, just a slow, sweet fading, man by man, until the ships sat empty on the sand, and the story of Odysseus never continued past this quiet shore. The poem does not dwell on this possibility with any weight of horror. It moves through the episode briskly, almost gently, as though even the telling of it wants to drift a little. But the danger is there all the same, folded into the softness of the scene. A crew undone not by an enemy, but by comfort. A homeward journey abandoned not through defeat, but through the simple erosion of wanting to go home at all. Odysseus, for what the poem is worth in its portrait of him, does not fall to the fruit himself. Or if he tastes it, the text does not say so, and tradition has generally read his abstention as evidence of the particular kind of will that will be asked of him again and again across the rest of the voyage. What the story does tell us clearly is what he does once he understands what has happened to the men he sent ashore. He does not reason with them. He does not wait for the effect to fade, does not try gentleness or persuasion against a pull that has already made persuasion meaningless to those under it. He goes to the shore himself, finds his men slack and unwilling, their eyes turned toward a horizon that no longer means anything to them, and he drags them. The poem uses that word, or one close enough to it in spirit, back toward the ships, weeping, resisting, wanting nothing so much as to be left where they were. He binds them beneath the rowing benches so they cannot simply walk back into the soft grass and the sweetness waiting there. And then, without ceremony, without a speech to mark the moment as anything more than what needed doing, he gives the order to push off, and the oars go into water, and the island falls away behind them the way every other shore in this story eventually will. It is easy to let this moment pass quickly in the telling, overshadowed as it will be by the Cyclops soon to come, and the sorceress, and the long fall into the underworld still waiting further on. But there is a case to be made that this is the poem's first true test of Odysseus's character, more revealing in its way than any contest of strength. Facing a monster asks for courage, and courage is a virtue the old stories are generous in rewarding. Facing your own men's willingness to give up, and finding in yourself the refusal to let them, even against their tears, even against what looks, in the moment, like their own desire, asks for something colder and less flattering. It asks a man to override the wishes of the people he leads, to decide that he understands their good better than they do in that instant, and to act on that judgment with enough force to bind them to benches they would rather not sit on. It is not a heroism that photographs well. There is no glory in it, no monster's head to hold aloft afterward. There is only a ship pulling away from a shore, and men weeping at oars they did not choose to take up again, and a captain standing amid them with the particular loneliness of someone who has just made a decision no one thanked him for. The ships move on from that coast, whatever coast it truly was, wherever the tide of memory and legend has finally settled it, in Jerba's low sand, or some vanished Libyan shoreline that left no other trace of itself. And behind them, the low green line of the lotus fades, the way every shore in this telling fades, into haze, into distance, into the same grey water that swallowed Ismarus and swallowed Troy before it. Ahead, the sea offers nothing yet to name. But something has shifted quietly in the hold of the ships, in the men who sit now at their oars with the sweetness of the fruit still faint on their tongues and the shame of having wanted to stay settling somewhere beneath their ribs. They have learned, without anyone saying so aloud, that the voyage home will not only be a matter of surviving what the sea sends against them. It will also be a matter of surviving what the sea, now and then, generously offers. And wanting still, in spite of it, to leave. Beyond the lotus shore, the sea narrowed the world again to wood and salt and the low complaint of the oars. And somewhere in that narrowing the ships came, in time, to a coast that smoked. Sailors who told this part of the story in later centuries would speak of a shoreline where the hills themselves seemed to breathe, where at night a red light pulsed along the ridges far inland, faint and steady as something sleeping badly. This was, by most reckonings that have survived the long argument among scholars, the coast of Sicily, and the mountain that watched over it, though never named outright in the old verses, wore a shape unmistakable to anyone who has stood before Etna and felt the ground hum faintly beneath a stillness that is not quite stillness. The Greeks who first carried this story across the water were not strangers to volcanic land. They knew Thera. They knew the smoking vents of their own islands. And when they imagined a race of lawless giants living in caves along a firelit shore, they were not inventing a landscape from nothing. They were describing, in the language of myth, a coast that unsettled them long before any Cyclops was named. The ships came ashore near evening, the way so much of this voyage seems, in retrospect, to have unfolded in that hour when light is uncertain and judgment softens with it. There was a small island offshore, thick with wild goats, and the men took their ease there for a night and a day, filling themselves on meat and rest before curiosity, always curiosity in this story more than hunger, turned their captain's eyes toward the mainland, where fires could be seen burning and voices, faint and enormous, seemed to carry across the water on the wind. He would not simply gather supplies and go. He wanted to know who lived behind those fires. It was a wanting that had already cost him men on other shores, and would cost him more before this coast released his ships. But it was also, the old poem insists gently, simply who he was. A man built by curiosity as much as by cunning, unable to leave a mystery at his back without turning to look at it. They found the cave near the shoreline, its mouth wreathed in laurel, its floor deep in the smell of milk and old fires. Pens for lambs and kids built along its walls with the patience of someone who had lived there a long time and expected to live there longer. The men who first entered it, by the account that has come down to us, wanted only to take what they could and leave. But their leader wished to see the owner of the place, to test, as he told it later, what kind of welcome a stranger might expect on so wild a shore. It is here that the story turns, slowly and irreversibly, from curiosity to consequence. The owner of the cave, when he came with a sound before a shape, the great weight of hooves and flocks funneling through the entrance, then the roll of a stone dragged across the mouth of the cave that no ordinary strength could have moved, sealing the space with the finality of a door closing on a room from which there is no other way out. Only then, in the firelight, did the shape resolve into something the men could not immediately name. Enormous, upright, human in outline, but wrong in scale. A single eye set wide in the center of a broad and weathered face, watching them with the mild, terrible curiosity of a creature unused to visitors and unafraid of them. It is worth pausing, in the telling of this part, on where such a figure might have come from. Not merely from a poet's invention, but from something older, stranger, and more grounded in the land itself. Sicily's caves, for centuries before and after this story was first sung, gave up bones that puzzled everyone who found them. long-tusked skulls of a creature long extinct, a dwarf elephant, a relative of the mammoth, native once to these islands, lay scattered in limestone caverns, and at the center of each skull, where a trunk had once attached, sat a single large socket that, to eyes untrained in anatomy and inclined toward wonder, looked uncannily like the socket of one great eye. Shepherds and travelers who came upon these skulls in dim caves, lit only by torch or lamp, could hardly be blamed for imagining a single-eyed giant once dwelling there, could hardly be faulted for carrying that image home to their fires and passing it, story by story, into the shape that would eventually be sung of a creature named Polyphemus. The myth in this light does not dissolve into mere invention. It becomes something closer to memory refracted, the bones of one animal reassembled by imagination into the shape of another, until the line between fossil and folklore blurred past separating. Whatever its origin, the creature in the cave was neither hospitable nor merciful. He asked where the ships were beached, and was answered with a careful lie about them being wrecked upon the rocks, a small deception meant to protect what remained of the fleet. It did nothing to soften what followed. 2 men were taken that first evening, lifted and used as a butcher uses meat, the sound of it recounted afterward, not with lingering horror, but with the hush of men still disbelieving what they had witnessed, the way survivors of a fire describe not the flames so much as the terrible ordinary silence that follows them. The poem does not dwell on the violence. It lingers instead on the details around it. The fire's light against the cave wall, the goat pens creaking as the flock shifted in fear, the small human sound of men trying to breathe quietly enough not to be noticed next. It was cunning, not strength, that answered the cave. The captain offered wine, strong and unwatered, a gift the giant drank without suspicion, delighted by a taste his simple life had never offered him, and asked in the loosening warmth of it for the name of the man who had given him such a thing. The answer he received, nobody, or something near enough to it in the old tongue, was a small, quiet joke, planted deliberately, a seed meant to bloom later into confusion, and it did. When the giant finally slept, heavy with wine and satisfaction, the men took up a stake of green olive wood, sharpened and hardened in the fire beforehand, and drove it into the single eye with all the strength their fear and grief could gather. The old telling does not linger on gore here either. What it lingers on is sound, the hiss of the wood searing flesh, likened in the poem to the hiss of iron plunged into water by a smith. A sound every listener in that ancient world would have known intimately from their own villages, ordinary and terrible now in this new context. It lingers on the giant's scream, enormous enough to bring his neighbors from their own caves along the ridge, calling through the dark to ask what troubled him, and on the strange, small answer that saved the men crouched inside. "Nobody is hurting me. Nobody has blinded me," called out in pain and confusion by the giant himself, so that his kin, hearing no name, shrugged and returned to their own fires. Assuming some private trouble had come upon their neighbor, that was no concern of theirs. It is a moment almost gentle in its irony, funny in the way old stories allow themselves to be funny for a breath before the weight returns. And it is entirely built on shadow and confusion rather than spectacle. The blinded giant's hands sweeping blindly through the dark of the cave. The men pressed flat beneath the bellies of sheep, breath held, waiting for dawn to open the stone door that only their captor's hands could move. When morning came and the flock was let out to graze, the giant felt along each animal's back for a rider, and found none, never thinking to feel underneath. The men left that cave clinging to the wool of sheep that did not know they carried the weight of an escape upon their backs, and once beyond the cave's mouth, once aboard the ships and pulling hard against the current, the captain could not resist one final act of pride, could not simply let the shore fall silent behind him. He called out his true name across the water, unable to leave, even in flight, without being known for what he had done. It is this detail, small and human and vain, that the story treats with its greatest weight. Because it is here, and only here, that the curse becomes personal. The giant, blind and roaring on the shore, was no ordinary creature but a son of the sea god, and his father heard that name carried across the water and did not forget it. From that moment, the sea itself, which had been until then simply wide and indifferent, became something closer to an adversary with memory, a god now watching, deliberately, for the ships that carried a name he had heard cursed against him. The voyage that follows from this shore onward is no longer a matter of chance encounters and wrong turns. It becomes a punishment tracked patiently across the water, storm by storm, island by island, for years, because a man could not resist being known, even by the thing he had just blinded and left howling on a smoking shore beneath a mountain that, to this day, still glows faintly red along its ridges at night, watched by anyone willing to sit still, long enough at the edge of that ancient coast to notice. North of that smoking coast, past the place where the Cyclops still nursed his ruined eye and called down curses on a name he had finally learned. Too late, there lay, in the old telling, an island that did not rest upon the sea floor at all, but floated upon the water, like a thing set loose from the ordinary weight of the world. Some who repeat the story say it turned slowly, a full circle, day and night, so that its cliffs faced every direction of the compass in their turn, and its harbour mouth opened toward a different horizon with each passing hour. This was the home of Aeolus, keeper of the winds, a king who kept his household in a manner unlike any other ruler in the tale. His sons married to his daughters in a closed and contented circle, feasting endlessly in a bronze-walled hall that never seemed to grow silent, while outside, bound and leashed like restless animals, the winds of the world waited on his word. It is a strange image to hold at this hour, this floating island of feasting and wind, and stranger still to think that sailors who came centuries after the poem was first sung aloud around fires still believed they had found the place. North of Sicily, scattered like dropped stones across a stretch of water prone to sudden weather, lie the islands the old Greeks and the Romans after them called Aeolian, and which still carry that name today. 7 islands, some volcanic, one of them, Stromboli, still glowing faintly at its summit on clear nights, spitting small showers of fire into the dark, in a rhythm so constant that ancient sailors called it the lighthouse of the Mediterranean, a beacon lit by the earth itself, rather than by any human hand. It is not difficult to understand how a place like this, wind-battered, fire-lit, isolated from the mainland by a channel of water known for turning calm mornings into churning afternoons, might have seemed to early listeners like the very seat of a god who commanded the air. There is no floating island there now, of course, nor any bronze hall of feasting sons and daughters. But there is a persistent local memory, kept alive in place names and in the quiet superstitions of fishermen who still glance at Stromboli's summit before setting out, that this cluster of islands was always a place where the wind seemed to answer to something other than ordinary weather. Ships passing through the straits nearby, between Sicily and the Italian mainland, have for as long as records exist, reported currents and gusts that behave with a peculiar violence, changing direction without warning, funneled and twisted by the narrow channel and the volcanic geography on either side. A sailor without instruments, without any way to know that heat and pressure and the shape of an undersea trench could conspire to produce sudden squalls, might reasonably conclude that some intelligence, some king or god, was moving air currents about like pieces on a board. The poem's Aeolus, then, may be less an invention than an explanation, a way of giving a face and a will to a pattern of wind that repeated itself too often and too dangerously to be dismissed as coincidence. Odysseus, in the story, is received here with a hospitality that stands in sharp and deliberate contrast to what came before. There is no violence in this island, no blinding, no monstrous appetite. Aeolus welcomes the wanderer for a full month, asking after the long war at Troy, and listening, the poem says, with real interest, feeding his guest at a table that never seems to run short. And when the time comes for departure, the king gives a gift that is, on its surface, an act of extraordinary generosity. A bag made from the hide of an ox, its mouth bound shut with a cord of silver, inside which he has gathered every wind of the world except one, the gentle western breeze that alone will carry the ships home to Ithaca. It is, in its way, one of the strangest objects in the entire voyage, stranger even than the enchanted plants and monstrous creatures that surround it, because it asks the listener to imagine wind not as weather, but as substance, something that can be caught, folded, and tied inside a container, small enough to be carried onto a ship's deck and stowed near the mast. For 9 days and 9 nights, the story tells us, the wind blows fair. Odysseus himself takes the helm the entire time, refusing to sleep, refusing to hand the steering over to any other hand, because he understands, better than his crew, how fragile this gift truly is. And on the 10th day, with the shape of Ithaca itself rising along the horizon, close enough that the men could make out fires burning on its hillsides, close enough to see smoke rising from what might have been their own homes, Odysseus finally allows exhaustion to take him. He sleeps. It is worth pausing on this moment longer than the poem itself does, because it holds within it one of the quietest and most human betrayals in the entire voyage. There is no monster here, no god's deliberate cruelty, no storm sent in vengeance. There is only a group of tired, curious men watching their captain sleep, looking at a swollen leather bag sitting near the mast, and wondering, in low voices among themselves, what treasure Aeolus might have hidden inside it that their captain has kept secret from them through 9 days of favorable wind. They do not imagine wind. Why would they? They imagine gold, imagine silver, imagine some portion of the wealth of a foreign king, withheld from the men who have shared every danger of the voyage equally. It is not malice that moves their hands toward the cord. It is the ordinary, unremarkable curiosity of men who have given years of their lives to a war and a voyage that has taken everything from them, and who feel, not unreasonably, that they deserve some share of whatever fortune their captain has been given. So they loosen the silver cord, and every wind that Aeolus bound inside that ox-hide bag comes rushing out at once, a violent unleashing of every gale and gust and storm wind held prisoner for the length of the journey. And it seizes the ships and drives them backward across the very distance they had just crossed, back across 9 days of sailing undone in a matter of hours, back out toward the floating island they had only just left behind. Ithaca, which had stood so close on the horizon that its hillside fires could be counted, slips away behind them, smaller and smaller, until it disappears entirely, swallowed by the same sea that had, for one deceptive stretch of days, seemed ready to give it back. There is something almost unbearably quiet about this reversal, when it is considered slowly rather than rushed past as a plot mechanism. This is not a shipwreck. No one drowns. No monster claims a portion of the crew. The tragedy here is entirely one of proximity and distance, of a homeland glimpsed and then withdrawn, not through any grand act of divine cruelty, but through the small, forgivable curiosity of exhausted men who wanted, perhaps, only to know what they had earned. It is the kind of loss that does not announce itself with violence. It simply happens, in the space of an untied cord, and then it is done, and the ships are moving the wrong way across water they had already crossed once with such hope. When Odysseus wakes to find his home vanished and his ships being driven back toward the island of Iolus, the poem allows him a long moment of despair, long enough that he considers, briefly, ending his own life in the sea rather than facing what has happened. He does not. He endures it as he endures everything else in this long chain of misfortunes, and returns to beg Aeolus for a second gift of favorable wind. But Aeolus refuses him now, not out of cruelty, but out of a kind of resigned certainty, telling his guest, in effect, that a man cursed as thoroughly as Odysseus appears to be cannot be helped by any wind a king might give him. The island that had offered such warmth now closes its doors, and the ships must find their way onward by other means, rowing where they cannot sail, into water that offers no further gifts. It is tempting, reading this section against the geography of the Aeolian Islands and the strait that separates Sicily from the Italian coast, to wonder how much of this quiet catastrophe might have grown from real sailors' memories of nearly reaching home, only to be driven back by sudden weather in exactly this stretch of water. The channel nearby, where volcanic islands rise steeply from a floor riddled with old eruptions and shifting pressure, has always been known among Mediterranean sailors as a place demanding particular respect. A place where the wind can shift within the span of an afternoon from a gentle, following breeze into something that turns a familiar coastline into a trap. No god needed to be invoked for real ships to be driven back along routes they thought they had already conquered. The sea near Stromboli and its sister islands has always been capable of this on its own, using nothing more than heat, pressure, and the particular shape of a narrow channel between volcanic stone. Perhaps this is why the story of Iolus endures with such quiet force even now. Stripped of its gods and its floating island, it speaks to something every sailor, ancient or modern, understands in their bones. That nearness to home is not the same as arrival, that a horizon holding the shape of a familiar shore can vanish again before nightfall, and that the distance between longing and safety is sometimes measured not in miles, but in the space of a single untied cord, a single moment's carelessness, a single hour when the man who should have been watching finally, understandably, allowed himself to sleep. They sailed north again, or so the old geographers have guessed, tracing the wake of Odysseus with fingers on parchment, long after the ships themselves had rotted into the seabed of memory. The wind that had once come so generously from Aeolus's bag was gone now, and in its place the 12 remaining vessels, for the fleet had been 12 when it left Troy, and 12 still, remarkably, after Ismarus, and after the Lotus Eaters, and after the cave of the one-eyed shepherd, moved forward under oar alone, dragging themselves through days that had no clear shape, no clear colour, nothing but the grey monotony of men rowing toward a home that kept sliding backward every time they reached for it. The days here blur in the old telling, as if the poem itself grew tired of counting them, and this weariness is perhaps the truest thing about the passage, a fatigue that seeps not only into the characters, but into the very air of the story, a fatigue any listener drifting toward sleep might recognize. That particular exhaustion that comes not from a single hardship, but from the accumulation of many small ones, none catastrophic alone, all of them heavy together. And then, after some unmeasured stretch of grey water, they came to a harbour unlike any they had seen before. Narrow, steep-walled, so enclosed by cliffs on either side that the sea within it lay flat and undisturbed, even when storms battered the world beyond. The poem describes it with unusual precision for something so ancient. A long, slender inlet, quiet as a held breath, ringed by rock so high that no swell could reach inside to trouble it. It should have seemed a mercy. 11 of the 12 captains thought so, and steered their ships gladly into that stillness, grateful after so much open sea for walls that promised shelter. Odysseus alone hesitated, whether it was instinct or memory of the cave that had swallowed 6 of his men not long before, or some deeper unease with places too perfectly calm. The poem does not say plainly, but it tells us that he moored his own ship outside the harbour's mouth, tying it to a rock at the entrance rather than sailing it into that flawless, sheltered water. It is a small detail, easy to pass over, and yet scholars who have spent lifetimes tracing these coastlines return to it again and again, because it is the hinge on which the entire episode turns. 1 ship stayed outside, 11 went in, and what waited inside that harbour was not shelter at all. Historians who study the poem's geography have proposed several places for this harbour over the centuries, and though none can be proven, each carries its own quiet plausibility. Some point far north, to the deep fjords of Norway, where the land splits into narrow channels so steep-sided that daylight itself seems to hesitate before reaching the water below. A place, they argue, that would have felt utterly foreign to Mediterranean sailors, cold and closed, and strange enough to inspire a story about giants who ate ships whole. Others look instead to Sicily's eastern coast, to certain narrow cliff-bound inlets near what is now called Cape Milazzo, where ancient traditions already lingered, long before Homer, about a race of enormous cannibal people who once lived along that shore. Both theories share the same intuition, that whatever inspired this passage of the poem was a real place remembered by real sailors, a harbour so unusually narrow and enclosed that it left a permanent mark in the oral memory carried from ship to ship, generation to generation, long before it was written down. What matters more than the exact coastline, though, is what the poem tells us happened once the 11 ships were inside. They call it now the land of the Laestrygonians, and the poem describes them as giants, vast, terrible people, who lived not by farming or fishing, but by throwing boulders down from the cliffs onto anything that entered their harbour. When the ships sailed in, when the men called out as sailors always call out upon reaching a new shore, hoping for welcome, or at least indifference, what answered instead was silence, and then stone. The poem does not linger on spectacle. It does not dwell, as later ages might, on screaming or blood or the particular horror of a rock falling from a great height onto a wooden hull. Instead, in its own hushed and ancient way, it simply tells us that the Laestrygonians came to the cliffs above the harbour and looked down at the ships trapped below like fish in a net, and began to hurl down boulders, huge as houses, the poem says, shattering hull after hull, until the water itself grew thick with wreckage and with men who had no shore to swim toward and no ship left whole enough to climb back into. 11 ships, every man aboard them, gone in the space of what must have been only minutes, though the poem gives us no clock, no way to measure how quickly it happened. Only the terrible fact of its completeness. Whatever giants waited on those cliffs did not pursue survivors into the water, did not chase down swimmers, did not need to. The harbour itself became the trap, its narrow walls the very thing that had promised safety, sealing every ship inside where the stones could find them one by one. It is worth pausing here, not to imagine the violence more vividly, but to imagine instead its aftermath, the sudden quiet that must have followed, the way sound falls away after catastrophe, leaving only water lapping against broken timber, only the creak of a single ship still whole, still floating, still tied to its rock at the harbour's mouth. Odysseus, watching from outside, could not have seen every detail of what happened within those walls, but he would have heard it. The impact of stone against wood, the particular groan of a hull giving way, and then, worse than any of it, the silence that came after. There is no record of what he did in that moment. The poem moves quickly past it, as if even the ancient storytellers could not bear to dwell there, could not find the words for a captain standing on his own deck, watching a harbour he had chosen not to enter. Swallow 11 ships of men he had led from Troy. What we know is only this: he cut the mooring line himself, or ordered it cut, and the one remaining ship pulled away from that cliff-shadowed water as quickly as oars could carry it, leaving behind no survivors to gather, no wreckage worth salvaging, nothing but the widening gap of open sea between his ship and a harbour that had become, in the space of one afternoon, a graveyard with no graves. It is here that the voyage changes its nature entirely, and it is worth sitting with that change rather than rushing past it toward whatever comes next. Until this point, however dire each episode had been, the loss of men to the Lotus, the loss of 6 to the Cyclops, the loss of the fair wind through carelessness, there had remained a fleet, reduced, wounded, weary, but a fleet nonetheless. 12 ships, a small floating village of Ithacan men who had left home together and who might, the poem always seemed to suggest, still return home together. Now there was one ship, one crew. Whatever men had survived Troy and the years before it, whatever faces Odysseus had known since childhood on the shores of his own island, most of them were gone now, sealed beneath water in a harbour whose name he may never have learned, in a country whose people he had glimpsed only as distant shapes on a cliff's edge, silent until they were not. The poem does not tell us what Odysseus said to the men who remained. It does not give us a speech, a lament, a moment of gathering the survivors to steady their nerve. Perhaps there was nothing to say. Perhaps the sound of oars moving through water, carrying them away from that place, was itself the only language left. What the poem does give us, quietly, almost in passing, is the simple fact that the ship sailed on, that whatever grief filled it, whatever silence settled over the remaining men, the sea did not pause to let them mourn. There was still a horizon ahead of them, unfamiliar and unnamed, and the current or the wind or simple necessity carried them toward it, whether they were ready or not. It is worth reflecting, at this point in the voyage, on the shape that Odysseus's journey has begun to take. Not merely a sequence of dangers survived, but a slow, relentless narrowing. Each stop along this path has cost him something that can't be recovered. Men at Ismarus, men to the Lotus, men in the Cyclops' cave, and now, in a single afternoon, nearly the whole of his fleet. The story does not frame this as simple misfortune, a string of bad luck befalling an otherwise fortunate man. It frames it, gently but unmistakably, as attrition. The price paid, piece by piece, ship by ship, for a homecoming that keeps receding no matter how far the survivors row. And so we are left, as the poem itself is left, with a single ship moving through waters that no longer hold any of the comfortable familiarity of the world Odysseus knew before the war. Every companion who might have shared the burden of memory, who might have said, "Do you remember this stretch of coast? Do you remember that harbour from years before?" is gone now. What remains is a smaller and smaller circle of men, and at its centre, a captain who carries the weight of every choice that brought them here. The choice to explore the Cyclops' cave. The choice to sleep while the winds slipped free. The choice, this time, to hesitate at a harbour's mouth while 11 other ships sailed trustingly inside. He was right to hesitate. It saved his life, and the lives of those still with him. But rightness offers little comfort against a silence so absolute, and the poem, in its unhurried way, seems to understand this, offering no praise for his caution, no relief in his survival, only the plain fact of the ship moving forward, alone now, into water that had not yet decided what it would ask of them next. The single ship carried its diminished company southward, past coastlines that offered no comfort and no explanation. Until at last, it came to rest against a shore that seemed, at first, to hold no threat at all. There was smoke rising from somewhere inland, the kind that suggested habitation rather than danger, and the scent of wood smoke drifting out across calm water. This was Aesir, the poem tells us, though what that name corresponded to in the world of stone and coastline has occupied scholars for as long as scholars have cared to look. The most persistent theory places it along the Italian promontory, now called Monte Circeo, a limestone headland rising abruptly from the marshland south of Rome, its name still carrying the echo of the woman who was said to live there. Whether this is memory or coincidence, whether ancient sailors mapped a real headland onto an old story, or the story simply borrowed a name that pleased it, no one can say with certainty. But the promontory exists. It can be walked, its caves can be entered, its slopes climbed, and standing at its summit, looking out over the same stretch of sea that separated it from the rest of the coast in antiquity, one understands why a place so isolated, so visibly cut off by water and marsh from the world beyond, might have gathered to itself the reputation of enchantment. Isolation breeds stories. A headland that stands alone, ringed by wetland and sea, invites the imagination to fill its silence with something other than the ordinary. Odysseus did not know, when he sent his men inland to investigate the smoke, what waited for them in the clearing beyond the trees. The poem describes a house of polished stone, a woman singing at her loom, and beyond her doorway, wolves and lions that did not behave as wolves and lions should. Creatures that approached the strangers not with menace, but with something closer to sorrow, as though they recognized in these new arrivals a fate they themselves had already suffered. The men, drawn by the woman's voice and by hunger, entered without hesitation. She fed them, and in the food she offered, or perhaps in a separate draught, the accounts vary in their emphasis, there was a substance that stripped from them the shape of men and gave them instead the bodies of swine. They kept their minds, the poem insists on this detail, with a kind of deliberate cruelty. They understood what had happened to them. They wept, in whatever way a pig can weep, and pressed themselves into a corner of the sty, refusing the acorns and mast that Circe scattered for them. Food fit for the animals they now resembled, but not for the men they still, somewhere beneath the bristled hide, remained. It is worth pausing here, not to dwell on the strangeness of the image, but to consider what it might have meant to the people who first told this story, around fires long before it was written down. A transformation into swine is not simply an act of magic performed for its own sake. It carries within it an old suspicion about appetite, about the ease with which a man led by hunger and desire might slip toward something base, something driven by instinct rather than reason. The sailors who wandered into Circe's house were, after all, hungry and far from home, willing to trust a stranger's table because their bodies demanded it. The poem does not moralize loudly about this. It rarely moralizes loudly about anything. But the shape of the story suggests an old folk logic, that men who abandon caution for appetite risk becoming, in some essential way, less than men. It is a story about the animal that waits beneath civility, patient, ready to surface when hunger or desire overrides judgment. Circe herself is neither villain nor monster in any simple sense. She is closer to a force of nature given a woman's shape, indifferent to the moral weight of what she does, transforming men the way a river might reshape a stone. Not out of malice, but because that is simply what she is capable of doing to those who come near. Odysseus resisted where his men had not, aided by a plant given to him by the god Hermes, and in resisting, he earned something rarer than victory: Circe's respect, and eventually her hospitality, freely given rather than imposed. The men were restored, made young again in the telling, restored more fully than the mere reversal of a spell should have allowed, as though the poem wanted to underscore that this was not simply an undoing, but a kind of grace. Odysseus and his crew remained on the island for a long while after that, a full year by some counts, though the poem passes over this stretch with the same quiet economy it reserves for moments of rest. There is little drama in contentment. The story lingers instead on what came before the calm and what would come after it. And what came after, in this case, was among the strangest requests any wanderer in the ancient world was ever asked to fulfill. Circe told him he must journey to the edge of the underworld itself, not to enter the realm of the dead in any full sense, but to stand at its threshold and speak with the shade of the prophet Tiresias, who alone could tell him the manner of his path home. This was not framed as punishment or trial, so much as necessity. The natural next step for a man who had already survived monsters and enchantment, and now needed knowledge that only the dead possessed. Where, in the world of real coastlines and real stone, might such a threshold have been imagined to exist? The scholars who have traced Odysseus's path with the most patience point toward the region near Cumae, on the Italian coast north of Naples, and toward the volcanic basin known as Lake Avernus. This is a landscape that does not require much imagination to seem otherworldly even now. The ground there steams in places. Sulfur rises from cracks in the earth, carrying with it an odor that ancient visitors likened to the breath of something buried and still faintly alive. The lake itself sits in the crater of an old volcanic depression, its water dark, ringed by trees that in antiquity grew so dense and so close to the shoreline that little light reached the surface below. The Greeks who settled this coast, and the Romans after them, came to regard the entire region as a gateway to the underworld, not as poetic flourish, but as something closer to literal belief. There were oracles here and a cave. The cave of the Sibyl still stands cut into the rock near Cumae, its long dark corridor leading travelers into the hillside, as though inviting them to walk, briefly, into the world beneath the world. It is not difficult to imagine how such a landscape, encountered by early sailors navigating an unfamiliar coast, might have seeded the image that grew eventually into the poem's account of Odysseus's descent. A place where the earth itself smells of decay, where mist rises without wind, where the water sits unnaturally still and dark. Such a place asks to be filled with story, the way an unlit room asks to be filled with imagined shapes. Odysseus, in the poem, performs the rites Circe instructs him in. He digs a trench, pours libations of milk and honey and wine, and offers the blood of sacrificed animals. And it is this blood that draws the shades of the dead toward him, thin and hungry for the memory of life that only living contact can restore to them, however briefly. The ghosts he meets there are not monsters. They are, in their way, the most human presences in the entire voyage. His own mother appears among them, having died of grief during his long absence, and their exchange is handled with a tenderness the poem rarely allows itself elsewhere. He reaches for her 3 times, longing to hold her, and 3 times she slips from his grasp like smoke. For the dead in this place have no substance to offer the living beyond words. Agamemnon appears as well, recounting in flat, exhausted tones the manner of his own death at the hands of his wife and her lover upon his return home, a return that should have been triumphant and was instead a slaughter, a detail Odysseus carries with him afterward as a quiet warning about what homecoming can sometimes conceal. And Achilles appears, greatest of the warriors at Troy, and says something that undercuts the entire glory of the war Odysseus had helped to win. That he would rather be a living slave, toiling for the poorest man on earth, than rule as king over all the dead. It is a line that has echoed for nearly 3,000 years, precisely because it refuses the easy comfort that heroism is supposed to offer. Death, in this telling, does not confer meaning on the lives spent pursuing it. It only ends them and leaves behind thin shades who remember, faintly and without pleasure, what it once felt like to be warm. There is no monster to fight in this section of the story, no wind to lose, no cave to escape. There is only this, a man standing at the edge of a smoking, sulphurous basin on the Italian coast, listening to the voices of everyone the war had taken from him, and understanding, perhaps for the first time, that the voyage home was never only about distance. It was about carrying the weight of the dead far enough to finally set it down. The ship left that grey harbour of the dead behind and returned to open water. And for a time the sea gave nothing back but the ordinary rhythm of oar and swell, the kind of quiet that lets a man believe, briefly, that the worst has already been asked of him. It had not. Somewhere ahead, past a stretch of blue that looked no different from any other stretch of blue, lay a coastline that sailors of a much later age would learn to call the Sorrentine shore, and beyond it a scatter of small islets rising sheer and pale from the water, which some would come to know as lee galley, the roosters, named for a shape some fishermen once saw in their silhouette, though what he was really seeing, most likely, was only stone weathered by centuries of wind into something that resembled, if one squinted and wanted badly enough to believe it, a listening shape crouched above the tide. It is here, or somewhere very near here, that the old story places the cliffs of the Sirens. And it is worth pausing on how modest the actual geography is, how unremarkable to the eye. There is no visible menace in these islets. They do not loom. They do not blacken the sky. They sit in the water the way many small islands sit in water, quietly, indifferently, catching the light in the late afternoon in a way that might strike a passing sailor as almost beautiful. And that, perhaps, is closer to the truth of what made this stretch of coast dangerous than any singing women ever could be. The real hazard here was not sound, but current. The way the water moves through this channel, pulled by tides and funneled by the narrow spaces between rock, capable of turning a ship's course before the crew even understood they had drifted. Sailors who did not know this coast could find themselves drawn steadily toward the islets without meaning to go there at all, the sea doing the work of seduction long before any voice needed to. The story remembers it differently, of course, because the story remembers everything in the register of danger made personal. In that telling, the Sirens sing, and their song is not simply pleasant, but unbearable in its beauty, promising each listener something specific to him alone: his home, his glory, the sound of a voice he thought he would never hear again. Odysseus, warned in advance, filled the ears of his men with beeswax so they would hear nothing at all, and had himself bound to the mast, wanting to hear the song and survive it, wanting the experience without the cost, which is perhaps the truest description of the man that exists anywhere in the poem. He heard it. He struggled against his ropes. His men, deaf and rowing, kept the ship moving through the strait until the sound fell away behind them and the danger passed. Strip the singing away, and what remains is a difficult passage of water near a beautiful, treacherous coastline, navigated by men who did not fully understand the currents that moved beneath them. The song becomes a kind of translation, a way of putting into human terms the disorientation that comes from being pulled somewhere by forces too large and too silent to argue with. A modern sailor entering that channel without knowledge of its currents might describe the sensation, if pressed, as something like being called. The water simply takes the ship where it wants the ship to go, and resisting that pull feels, from inside a small wooden hull, uncannily like resisting a will. They passed it. The story allows them that. But there was no time to rest in the relief of having survived one danger, because the sea, in this stretch of coastline, had arranged its dangers in immediate succession, as though testing whether a crew that had endured one trial had any strength left over for the next. Ahead of them lay the strait, narrow and fast-moving, and it is here that most who study this coast believe the truest geographic seed of the story lies. The passage now called the Strait of Messina, the thin channel of water separating the Italian mainland from Sicily, a place where two seas meet and where, even now, sailors speak of tidal effects strong enough to unsettle a modern engine-driven vessel, let alone an oar-powered ship of an age with no charts and no warning beyond the memory of those who had sailed the water before. On one side of this narrow passage, the old story places a monster with 6 heads and a voice like the yelping of dogs, rooted to a cliff so high its peak vanished into cloud, reaching down to snatch sailors from passing decks with a swiftness no defense could answer. This is Scylla. On the other side, close enough that avoiding one meant risking the other, the sea itself was said to open into a churning throat that swallowed water and ships alike and spat them back out hours later in pieces, if it returned anything at all. This is Charybdis. Between them, the story insists there was no safe middle course. A ship could hug one shore or the other, but never both at once, and whichever choice a captain made, the sea would take its toll on that side of the strait. What the old sailors likely encountered when they first came upon this passage was something considerably less mythic and hardly less dangerous. A stretch of water where the tidal currents from 2 different bodies of sea collide and twist against each other, producing whirlpools and sudden violent eddies capable of spinning a small vessel off its course entirely, sometimes drawing it under briefly before releasing it, battered, back to the surface. Anyone who has stood on the shore at Messina during the strongest tidal changes has seen the water do things that look, from a safe distance, deliberate, as if something beneath the surface is stirring, deciding, choosing whom to take and whom to let pass. It requires very little imagination to understand how ancient sailors, watching that motion from the deck of a low wooden ship with no understanding of tidal mechanics, might have concluded that they were looking at breath rather than current, appetite rather than physics. And on the opposing shore, the tall, dark cliffs that rise sharply from the water near this same strait, cliffs pocked with sea caves worn into shapes that catch shadow strangely in the late light, would have offered a natural home for whatever menace a frightened sailor might imagine lurking there, watching, waiting for a ship to pass close enough to reach. The story tells what happened next, with restraint that is easy to miss if a listener is waiting for spectacle. There is no lingering battle. There is no confrontation to win. Odysseus, warned in advance by Circe that Scylla could not be fought, and that any attempt to do so would cost him more men than passing quickly ever would, chose to keep to the side of the rock rather than the whirlpool, understanding that the whirlpool, given the chance, could take the entire ship at once, while the rock, however terrible, could only reach as far as its arms allowed. So the ship moved into the strait, and what the story offers in that passage is not the clash of weapons, but a catalogue of sound. The groan of the current pulling at the hull, the laboured creak of oars straining against water that no longer behaved the way water should. Somewhere beneath all of it, a low, continuous roar. The whirlpool at work on the far side, drawing everything nearby into its throat and holding it there before releasing it, changed. And then, cutting through that roar, the yelping, described in the old telling as something like the sound of young dogs, though wrong in some way that made the comparison worse rather than better. A noise that did not belong to any creature a sailor might expect to encounter this far from land. The men rowed. That is the entirety of what they could do. There was no weapon to raise against a threat that struck from above and vanished before it could be seen clearly. no course correction that could put more distance between the ship and the rock without steering it instead into the whirlpool's reach. And so they simply endured the passage, oars biting the water in that same steady, unglamorous rhythm that had carried them across every other stretch of sea in this long ordeal. While overhead, 6 times the reaching came. The story does not dwell on it. It does not name each man taken, does not linger on the particular horror of watching a companion vanish upward, out of reach, gone before understanding had even fully registered what was happening. It simply states, with the same restraint that runs through this entire stretch of the telling, that 6 men were lost, snatched from the deck as the ship passed beneath the cliff, and that their cries, brief, cut short, were the last sound Odysseus heard from them before the ship cleared the strait, and the roaring behind them began, slowly, to fade. There is something almost unbearable in how quietly the story lets this loss happen. No funeral rites are performed for these 6. No names are spoken over their absence. No pause is given to the ship's forward motion to allow for grief. The narrowness of the strait did not permit it, and the story in this is faithful to something true about disaster at sea. That survival sometimes requires moving immediately past loss without the comfort of ceremony, because stopping to mourn is itself a danger the sea will not forgive. What lingers, long after the strait has been left behind, is the arithmetic of it. 6 men traded for the survival of the rest, paid out to the rock the way toll is paid to a road that offers no negotiation. The whirlpool remained undefeated behind them, still turning, still capable of taking a whole ship if given the chance. And the only mercy in the passage was that it had not been given that chance this time. It would be given other chances, in other tellings, with other ships, for as long as sailors continued to thread that same narrow water between 2 ancient dangers that were never, in truth, so different from each other. Both of them simply the sea, doing what the sea does in narrow places, with no memory of the 6 men it kept, and no answer for the ones who lived long enough to remember losing them. There was, after Scylla and Charybdis, a long stretch of sea that no source troubles to describe in detail, as though even the ancient tellers of the tale had grown tired of counting losses and wished only to move their hero somewhere quiet. And so he came, eventually, to an island that does not announce itself with cliffs or fire or hunger. An island that seems, in every account of it, to exist slightly outside the ordinary run of geography. Ogygia, the resting place of the nymph Calypso, daughter of Atlas, keeper of a shore so still that even the wind, when it came, seemed to arrive reluctantly, as though it too had been persuaded to linger. Historians and geographers have offered their guesses across the centuries, each with the same faint apology that accompanies every attempt to pin myth to stone. Malta has been named, its limestone coves and blue grottos matching in some tellers' eyes the description of a cave mouth opening onto the sea, draped in vine, ringed by soft meadow grass, where violets and wild celery grew without being planted by any hand. Gozo, Malta's smaller sister, has been named as well, its own caves and cliffs offered as evidence, though evidence is too strong a word for what amounts to a resemblance. A shape half remembered, fitting a shape half invented. Other scholars, less willing to commit to either, have suggested that Ogygia was never meant to correspond to any specific coastline at all, that it exists in the poem's architecture as a kind of narrative pause, a place built not from geography but from grief, an island shaped entirely around the experience of being stopped. This last theory carries a certain weight, if only because of how the island behaves in the story. Every other stop along Odysseus's route announces itself through danger. The flower that dissolves memory, the giant who devours, the winds that scatter, the rock that swallows ships whole. Ogygia announces itself through comfort, It is the only place in the entire voyage where nothing attacks him, where nothing tries to kill him, where the danger is not violence, but the absence of any reason to leave. And it is here, on this island whose location no mapmaker can confirm, that he remains for 7 years, the longest single stop in the whole of his wandering. Longer than the war itself, in some countings, a stretch of time so vast that it becomes less an event in the story and more a kind of silence stitched into its middle. A pause the poem itself seems almost embarrassed to admit to. 7 years. It is worth sitting with that number the way the ancient audience would have sat with it, turning it over slowly, feeling its true shape. A man who could not stay anywhere longer than the winds allowed him, who fled a lotus shore because staying too long meant forgetting, who escaped to Cyclops' cave through sheer improvisation and nerve, who watched 6 of his men vanish into the mouth of a monster because he refused to slow his ship even slightly. That same man remained motionless on a single shore for 7 years, without struggle, without escape attempt, without even the urgency that had defined every other chapter of his journey. It is not laziness. It is not, by any honest reading, contentment either. It is something closer to what happens to a person after loss accumulates past the point where grief can be actively felt. A kind of suspension, a stillness that is not peace, but the exhaustion that sometimes wears peace's clothing. Calypso, for her part, is not written as a villain. She is not Circe, luring men into transformation, nor Polyphemus, hungry and violent. She is, if anything, gentler than almost any other figure Odysseus encounters on his long detour home. She feeds him, she shelters him, she offers him, according to the old telling, immortality itself, a life without end, without wounds, without the grinding erosion of years, if only he will stay with her forever and let Ithaca fade the way every other mortal concern eventually fades from a life extended past its natural length. It is, by any ordinary measure, an extraordinary offer. Kingdoms are lost for less. Wars are fought for less. And yet the poem tells us, with a plainness that carries more weight than any dramatic flourish could, that he weeps. Every day, we are told, he goes to the shore and sits, looking out over the water toward the direction he believes his home to lie. And he weeps for what he cannot reach, weeps even in the middle of comfort, even in the middle of an island that wants for nothing, even beside a goddess who loves him and asks so little of him beyond his presence. There is something almost unbearable in that image, if one lets it settle rather than rushing past it. A man offered eternity in tears, because eternity is not what he wants. He wants a smaller thing, an aging wife, a home grown over with weeds in his absence, a son he has not seen become a man, a rocky island with none of Ogygia's soft beauty. He wants the specific over the infinite. He wants an ending, even an uncertain one, over an unbroken continuation without shape or arrival. It is perhaps the clearest window the whole epic offers into what home actually means in the story. Not comfort, not safety, not immortality, but simply the place where a particular life, his life, was meant to happen, and nowhere else will substitute for it, no matter how gently the substitute is offered. For 7 years, this weeping changes nothing. The island holds him the way grief holds a person who has stopped resisting it. Not through chains, not through walls, but through the simple accumulation of days that make leaving feel less and less like an available option. There is no storm to escape here, no monster to outwit, no obstacle a clever man might turn to his advantage. There is only time, moving without incident, and a longing that has nowhere to go and no way to spend itself. In this way, Ogygia becomes less a place on any map and more a rendering of a particular kind of exile. The exile that has no enemy to blame, no obstacle to strategize against, nothing but the self and its endless, useless wanting. And then, as the story tells it, mercy arrives from an unexpected direction. Not from Odysseus's own cleverness, which has carried him through every other trial, but from outside him entirely, from the gods themselves, moved by whatever combination of pity and narrative necessity governs their attentions. Zeus sends Hermes down to the island with an instruction Calypso cannot refuse, however much she might wish to. She must let him go. She must help him build the raft that will carry him away from her shore, must give him the tools, the food, the following wind, must stand at the edge of her own domain and watch the man she loves prepare to leave her forever. Because the story requires it, because the fates require it, because 7 years is, apparently, the precise length of stillness the universe will tolerate before insisting a life move forward again. There is a strange, quiet grace in how the poem handles her response. She does not rage. She does not attempt to hold him by force, though she certainly could. She grieves in her own register the way gods grieve, with a kind of resigned sorrow that has already accepted the outcome before the outcome fully arrives. And then she helps him. She shows him where the tallest trees grow, gives him the axe to fell them, teaches him the proportions a raft must hold to survive open water, provides him wine and water and bread for the crossing, sends a warm wind to carry him from her shore toward whatever waits beyond the horizon. It is one of the few moments in the whole epic where a farewell is allowed to be gentle rather than violent, where a threshold is crossed not through struggle, but through permission finally granted. The raft itself becomes, in this telling, something larger than a vessel. For 7 years, Odysseus has built nothing, attempted nothing, moved toward nothing. The raft is the first act of forward motion his own hands have made since arriving on that shore, and there is something quietly moving in the picture of him at work, cutting timber, binding planks, shaping a hull from raw wood on a beach that has asked nothing of him for years, and now finally receives from him the shape of his own returning will. It is not a grand ship. It is not built for war or glory. It is a simple, modest thing, lashed together from what the island offers, sufficient only to carry one man back into the uncertainty he has chosen over the certainty he was offered. But it is, more than anything else in this stretch of the story, evidence that stillness has not become permanent, that even 7 years of suspended time can end, that a man who wept every day beside a sea he could not cross can still, when finally allowed, remember how to build something and set it upon the water. He leaves Ogygia's exact location behind for history to argue about. Malta, Gozo, some islet swallowed by centuries and unremembered by any surviving map, or perhaps nowhere at all, a place that exists only in the shape of a particular grief given an address. What the poem carries forward instead is the raft itself, small and plain, pushed out onto a sea that has already claimed so much of what he set out with, carrying him now toward the next unknown shore, and toward dangers that no 7 years of stillness could have prepared him for. The raft does not survive the telling, only the man does, and by the time the story turns its attention fully homeward, the sea has already worn him down to something harder and quieter than the king who once sailed from Troy with 12 ships and a company of men who no longer exist, except as names spoken over their own graves. Ithaca waits at the far end of all this water, and it waits, the poem insists, exactly where it has always waited, a small island rising grey and rocky from the Ionian Sea, modest beside its neighbours, its harbours narrow, its hills better suited to goats than to kings. And yet scholars have spent more than 2 centuries standing on the shore of the island that now bears the name Ithaca, comparing its cliffs and bays to Homer's descriptions, and finding, again and again, that the geography refuses to settle comfortably into place. The poem describes an island, low-lying and westward-facing, easily seen from the sea, with a particular relationship to its neighbouring islands that modern Ithaca does not quite replicate. Some who have made this comparison, their life's work have turned instead to Kefalonia, the larger island nearby, wondering whether ancient tectonic shifts might have altered the coastline enough that what Homer knew as Ithaca has since become something else, absorbed into a larger landmass or separated from it in ways the intervening centuries have obscured. Others hold firm to the traditional identification, arguing that a poet working in formula and inherited memory was never obligated to render cartography with perfect fidelity, that the Ithaca of the poem is as much a feeling as a place, the specific, aching shape of every home a man has been kept from too long. The argument continues in academic journals and in the quiet arguments of local guides who have staked their livelihoods on one hillside or another, being the true site of the palace, the true cave of the nymphs, the true harbour where a disguised king once stepped ashore on sand. He had not felt beneath his feet in 20 years. No resolution seems imminent, and perhaps none is needed. The debate itself has become part of the island's inheritance, layered over the older uncertainty like sediment. What the poem is far more certain about is the manner of the return, and it insists, with a patience that outlasts every geographical quarrel, that homecoming was never going to be simple arrival. The king does not sail into his own harbour with banners lifted. He is set down on the shore by Thracian sailors while he sleeps, unaware even of his own landing, and wakes to a coastline transformed by a goddess's mist into something unrecognizable, so that for a long moment he does not know he has finally reached the place he spent 10 years trying to reach. This is the poem's quiet cruelty and its quiet mercy, both that the homecoming does not announce itself, that recognition must be earned, even by the man doing the returning. Athena disguises him further, aging his skin, stripping the muscle from his frame, dulling his eyes, turning a king into the likeness of a beggar so that he might walk his own island unseen by those who would kill him for what he still owns. He goes first, not to his palace, but to the hut of a swineherd, a loyal old servant named Eumaeus, who does not recognize the disguised man before him as anything more than a wandering stranger deserving of hospitality. And it is here, in this low, smoke-filled dwelling, smelling of animals and wood smoke, that the king first learns how far his house has fallen, how his wife has been besieged for years by suitors who feast in his hall, drink his wine, slaughter his cattle, and press her toward a marriage she has delayed through every craft available to a woman with no army of her own. The recognition, when it finally comes, arrives first, not through any human eye, but through an animal's failing senses. Argos, the hound he raised as a pup 20 years before and left behind when he sailed for Troy, lies now on a heap of dung near the gate, old and flea-bitten and abandoned, ignored by the household that once valued him. He is dying, has perhaps been dying for some time, kept alive by nothing more than the patience old dogs sometimes carry toward an ending they are not yet ready to permit themselves. And when the disguised king passes near him, something in the animal stirs, some memory beneath memory, some recognition that does not require eyes grown dim with age. And Argos lifts his head and wags his tail and tries, one last time, to rise and go to the master he has waited 2 decades to see again. The king cannot acknowledge him without breaking the disguise that keeps him alive, and so he looks away, wipes a tear he hopes his guide does not notice, and continues walking. And in the poem, this is the whole scene, no more elaborate than this. The aging dog manages the small motion of recognition, and then, having accomplished what he seems to have been waiting for, he dies. It is a moment given no more weight in terms of lines than 100 other passing details in the poem. and yet it has outlasted nearly everything else in the story, in the memory of those who encounter it. Perhaps because it asks nothing of the reader, except to notice how loyalty can outlive almost everything, including the body that carries it, including the recognition it has been waiting so long to offer. The palace itself, when the king finally enters it, still disguised as a beggar, is loud with the suitors feasting, thick with insult and mockery, directed at the ragged stranger who has come to sit at its edges. He endures blows, endures having a footstool thrown at him, endures the particular humiliation of being unknown in the hall where his authority was once absolute, and he endures it with the patience the poem has spent its whole length teaching him. A patience earned through Cyclops and witch and whirlpool, and years of stillness on a nymph's island. The recognition, when it widens beyond the dog, comes slowly and through several careful stages. An old nurse who bathes his feet and finds the scar left by a boar's tusk decades before, and who nearly cries out before he silences her. His wife, who tests him with careful, oblique questions before permitting herself any certainty. And finally, the suitors themselves, who recognize him only in the last moments of their lives, when the beggar picks up the great bow that none of them could string, and bends it as though it were nothing, and turns it toward the men who have spent years consuming his household and courting his wife against her will. What follows is described by the poem without spectacle, without any lingering satisfaction in the violence itself. The suitors die one after another in the hall, cut down by arrows and then by sword, and the poem does not dwell on the bodies with relish so much as with a kind of grim inventory. This one begged, this one fought, this one was struck down before he could rise from his seat. There is a terrible efficiency to it, the efficiency of a man who has waited 20 years for this exact reckoning, and finds, now that it has arrived, that there is no pleasure left in it, only necessity, only the quiet mechanical work of restoring order to a house that disorder claimed in his absence. The maidservants who took the suitor's side are dealt with afterward, and this too the poem records without flinching and without celebration, a grim closing of accounts rather than a moment of triumph. And then, at last, comes the quieter reckoning. Not with enemies, but with the wife who has waited through every year of his absence, with a patience the poem treats as equal in weight to his own suffering, if differently shaped. She does not run to him. She tests him first, cautious even now, uncertain whether the man standing before her, bathed and restored to his true appearance by the goddess's hand, is truly her husband, or some further trick played upon a household already so battered by deception. She orders the marriage bed moved from its chamber, knowing that this is impossible, that the bed was built by the king himself around the trunk of a living olive tree, still rooted in the earth beneath the house, immovable by design, a secret only the two of them and one old servant would know. When he objects, startled and briefly angry that such a thing could be suggested, she has her proof, and only then does she yield to the recognition she has delayed testing for so long. This, the poem suggests without saying so directly, is what homecoming actually resembles. Not a triumphant arrival, but a slow, careful settling. A rediscovery conducted in stages, tested and confirmed rather than simply declared. A kingdom must be reclaimed piece by piece. A marriage must be re-entered rather than resumed. Even the bed, rooted in living wood, stands as a quiet argument that some things cannot be uprooted by 20 years of absence, that permanence is possible even after everything else has been so thoroughly disturbed. On modern Ithaca, archaeologists continue the patient work of searching for physical traces of this ending, excavating hillsides for the remains of a Bronze Age palace, examining pottery shards and foundation stones for anything that might align with the world the poem describes. Some findings have offered tantalizing suggestions of habitation from the right era. None have offered certainty. The trench remains open, in the literal and figurative sense, the way it so often does with stories this old, and the island continues to hold its silence about whatever truth once lived within it, offering fragments to those patient enough to keep digging and withholding, as the sea so often does, the rest. There is a particular kind of stillness that settles over a chart once all the pins have been placed, once every strait and cave and island has been marked and argued over and marked again. It is the stillness of a question that has been asked so many times, by so many careful hands, that the asking itself has become a kind of tradition, older now than some of the answers it was meant to find. For nearly 3,000 years, in one form or another, someone somewhere has bent over a map, or a coastline, or a fragment of pottery, tracing the same rough arc across the same blue water, murmuring the same quiet question that Herodotus murmured, that Strabo murmured, that generations of sailors and scholars and dreamers have murmured since. Where, if anywhere, did he actually go? The scholars came first with scrolls, then with sextants, and eventually with trowels and brushes and the slow patience of stratigraphy, and each brought their own certainty, and each certainty eventually softened into something more provisional, more willing to sit beside the uncertainties of the others. The sailors came with different instruments. Currents felt through a hull, winds read off the shoulder, the particular color a sea turns before a storm. And they too added their testimony, layer upon layer, until the coastline of the wandering became something closer to a palimpsest than a map, one story written over another, none of them quite erased, none of them quite whole. If one were to look now at that chart, worn soft at its folds from centuries of hands, the old proposed harbours would still be there, faint as watermarks, each holding its portion of the tale. There is Troy, first of all, low and wind-swept above the plain where the Scamander still finds its way to the sea. The mound at Hisarlik, holding its layered rings, the way a tree holds its years, city built upon city, until archaeology itself became a kind of excavation of memory. Each stratum a rumor of a war that might have happened, might have been remembered wrong, might have been many wars folded into one telling. The walls that once stood there are gone now, worn back into the hill, but the hill remains, and pilgrims still climb it in the early light, still stand where a horse of wood might have creaked once through gates long since turned to dust, and they still feel, however briefly, the old vertigo of standing inside a story. There is Sicily, vast and volcanic, its interior still trembling faintly with old fire, where the coast near Aci Trezza still shows its black rocks tumbling into blue water. Stones that legend insists were flung by a blinded giant in his fury. Though geologists will speak instead of ancient eruptions, lava cooling mid-fall into the sea. Both explanations agree in their own way on the violence of that shore, on the sense that something enormous once happened there, whether it wore the shape of a Cyclops or simply the shape of the earth itself breaking open. There are the Aeolian Islands, small and windswept, rising like a loose constellation from the sea between Sicily and the mainland, where the old story of a bag of winds still finds a strange logic in the geography. For even now the winds there behave unpredictably, gusting from one direction and then another with little warning, as though something invisible were testing the boundaries of a container never meant to hold it. Sailors still respect those waters. Some still speak of them, half in jest, as unruly. There is Monte Circeo, rising unexpectedly from the flat marshland of the Italian coast, a limestone promontory that must once, before the marshes were drained, have looked very much like an island rising alone from water, enchanted, isolated, exactly the kind of place a wandering mind might imagine a sorceress keeping her herds and her strange transformations. The town that bears her name still sits at its base, and visitors still climb the old paths, half expecting, however irrationally, to feel something of that old enchantment in the wind moving through the scrub grass. There is the Strait of Messina, narrow and swift, where the tides between Sicily and the mainland create real whirlpools, real turbulence, real danger for vessels caught in the wrong current at the wrong hour, so that the ancient warnings of a monster on one side and a devouring gulf on the other read now less like fantasy and more like sailors doing their best to describe, in the only language available to them, the genuine hazard of moving water they could not fully explain. There is Malta, sun-bleached and ancient, where a cave near Gozo still opens toward the sea and still draws visitors who want to stand where a nymph might once have kept a man against his own longing. 7 years folded into what must have felt, from the inside, like both an instant and an eternity. The particular arithmetic of grief and comfort that makes time behave strangely, whether or not any goddess was ever truly there to enforce it. And there is Ithaca itself, rocky and modest, rising green and steep from the Ionian, where hillsides still hold the foundations archaeologists continue to sift through, hoping to find the outline of a palace where a wife might have unwoven her own patience, night after night, waiting. The trench, as it was said before, remains open. The island keeps its own council. Each of these places, laid together on the chart, forms something less like a map and more like a constellation, points of light separated by dark water, each meaningful largely in relation to the others, each drawing its significance not from certainty but from pattern, from the way the mind insists on tracing a line between them, even when the line itself may be an invention. This is, perhaps, the oldest habit of human thought: to look at scattered points and see a shape, to look at a coastline and a story and insist that they must, somehow, be the same thing wearing different clothes. And perhaps they are, or perhaps they are not, and the insistence itself is the only truth available. The need, ancient and unhurried, to believe that longing leaves a mark on the actual world, that a voyage undertaken by a man who may never have existed, nonetheless, pressed itself into real stone, real current, real wind. Myth and geography have always moved toward each other like this, blurring at their edges, each borrowing the other's weight. The poem needed real coastlines to feel true. The coastlines, in turn, borrowed something from the poem, a kind of second life, an added dimension, so that a cave is no longer simply a cave, but a cave that might have held a nymph's grief. A strait no longer simply a strait, but a strait that might have swallowed ships whole under the name of a monster. The land remembers nothing on its own. It is only ever people who remember, who assign, who return generation after generation to stand on a particular shore and feel the old story settle briefly over the present moment like a mist that will not quite lift. What outlasts the ships in the end is not the wood or the sail, or even the memory of a particular hull moving through particular water. What outlasts the ships is the longing that built them, the old human ache to leave, and the older, harder ache to return, the specific and universal grief of distance from home, the specific and universal hope that someone is still waiting, still weaving, still watching the horizon for a shape that might, after everything, finally resolve into a familiar sail. That longing does not require verification. It does not need Troy to be exactly where the trench says it might be, or Circe's cave to be exactly the limestone hollow tourists now climb toward. It only needs the water to still move the way it moved then, the wind to still behave the way it behaved then, the human heart to still ache the way it ached then, stretched between the pull of the unknown and the pull of home. And the water does still move that way. If one were to stand now at the edge of the Ionian Sea, in the hour when the light goes copper and then grey, when the islands along the horizon lose their edges and become soft blue suggestions of themselves, it would be possible to watch the waves arrive, one after another, indifferent and patient, the way they have arrived for every century that came before this one. They do not pause. They do not announce whether they remember a wooden ship that may or may not have passed through them 3,000 years ago, waited with a man too restless to stay and too worn to fully return. They simply continue, folding over themselves in the dusk, carrying nothing forward but their own motion, their own old rhythm, indifferent to the question of whether any particular hull ever cut through them at all. And yet the question persists, gentle and unresolved, the way the tide persists against a shore that never quite keeps it. Perhaps that persistence is itself the answer, or the closest thing to one that the sea will ever offer. Not a location pinned exactly onto a map, not a trench that yields its final proof, but a feeling that continues to return, wave after wave, to anyone standing at the water's edge in that particular hour of fading light, listening for the outline of an old story still moving somewhere beneath the surface. If you have enjoyed drifting through this particular voyage, there are other lost ships and long-forgotten crossings waiting quietly on this channel whenever you feel ready to wander again. For now, let the waves settle, let the light fade fully, and let the sea keep whatever it chooses to keep.